let me go ahead and introduce Mr. Tom Martin, who is with the Council on Post-Secondary Education, who's going to introduce our speaker. And the Council is also a big sponsor of the festival. They support what's called the CPE Scholars, which are 50 students from around the state. They offer full scholarships to come to the IdeaFestival every year so that other students get this opportunity. So, Tom?
What does Howard Schultz, the founder and CEO of Starbucks Coffee, and Chris Rock, the comedian, have in common? What does it mean to be an experimental innovator? How do we apply creative and critical thinking to understand complex, ill-structured problems and develop approaches to solve these problems? How do we steer clear of status quo thinking? We do that with little bets. Peter Sims' latest book, Little Bets, How Breakthrough Ideas Emerge from Small Discoveries, grew out of a collaboration with faculty at Stanford's Institute of Design and his previous work in venture capital with Summit Partners. He was also co-author with Bill George of the bestseller True North, Discover Your Authentic Leadership. He is a member of GE's Innovation Advisory Council and is a co-founder and director of FuseCore, a social venture that places entrepreneurial leaders on year-long grassroots projects with mayors and governors to tackle some of America's most pressing problems. He came to Kentucky last night. He has used the words cool, I love it, and awesome about 100 times. He has been shown great Kentucky and Louisville hospitality. It is my honor and privilege, and please welcome Mr. Peter Sims.
You're right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And he's right. I have used those words. And it's an honor to be here with you today. This is a really cool auditorium hall. I've done several of these events around the country. And I love, in particular, the stay curious as the mantra. This is actually the same thing that Howard Schultz tells his son, or has told his son, from a young age. Stay curious. That's the one piece of advice he's given his son, Jordan. And I had the opportunity to interview Howard for the first book that Tom mentioned, True North, on leadership, and have kept in touch with him. He's been an amazing person to have as a role model, as a friend and mentor. And he says, stay curious. And I think that's actually at the root of Little Bets, this book that I'll share about today. And before I begin, I'll just mention what I did for dinner last night, which was to go to the Smokehouse, or Smoketown. Has anybody here been to Smoketown recently? All right. I tell you, this was an amazing experience. I'm here with Kevin Collar, who's going to be here later today, one of the first employees of Facebook, and he's going to be speaking at noon-ish. I would love to be here for that. Unfortunately, I have to leave, but he was a very insightful person to talk with, and that's his fiancée, Kara, they're getting married in 2 weeks. So we had a great conversation about that. And for anybody here know Eric David Gould, who runs Smokehouse? He says that the Smoketown could also be called the Redneck Jew Barbecue, which I thought was amazing. So one of the great joys of doing what I do is that I get to go around the country, and I've been in 50 to 60 cities or metropolitan areas over the past year, learning and talking with people like Eric and like people in the audience here, and had a nice conversation with the folks at Humana this morning. And, you know, we're living in a time where if you watch the national media, it's pretty dour, it's pretty depressing. And one of the things that always strikes me in going around the country is that what's actually going on in the trenches, what's actually going on with people is completely separate from the narratives and from all the hysteria we hear coming out of Washington and the New York media cycle. And I really don't quite understand that, because Eric is running a business he loves. He's doing projects on the side. He's making a decent living, and he's wanting to be a part of this. He's very involved in the community, close to people who he's close friends with, wanting to be a part of the solution rather than being a part of the problem. And here we are at this moment in U.S. history where we have a lot of corruption, and I don't think that's too strong a word, in our institutions, and we have to do something about it. So that's just a framing of the context where we are. And you know, I'm passionate about entrepreneurship and creativity and innovation, because I think that's really, at the end of the day, what we do really well here in this country. I had the opportunity to work abroad. I used to work in venture capital before getting into being an accidental author, and I worked in London and spent a lot of time in Germany and going through all the different European countries and seeing how entrepreneurship works there. And really, I have a lot of respect for each of those countries, the way they approach business and problem solving, but there really is nothing like the entrepreneurial spirit and the willingness to take risk and the willingness to try things that exists here in the United States. And the plethora of small businesses that emerge from people like Eric, who decide that they're going to start something with a credit card and build from there. And so I hope to share some insights with you about my research for this book and experiences that will be useful to your lives, and then we'll talk about Q&A. So we'll leave 20 minutes for Q&A. So I want to begin this discussion about Little Bets by sharing the story with you of Pixar and how Pixar came to be. So this company originally started out as a company that made hardware. Now, how many people realize that Pixar started as a hardware company? Okay, wow, that's actually very impressive. That's amazing that you would know that. I mean, maybe some of you have read Little Bets. Maybe you've read the history of Pixar. That's very encouraging. So I don't want to be repetitive if there are a lot of people who've read the book. But so essentially, here's the reason why I think this is such an amazing story to share at the outset, is that nobody would have predicted that Pixar would become what it became. And so Tom mentioned Howard Schultz. When Howard Schultz went to Italy and had his inspiration to start Starbucks, he went to Milan. He had this great coffee experience in Milan, and he was sitting there in these bars in Milan and having this great community coffee experience. And he said, well, I want to bring that back to the United States. And why don't we have that type of romance with coffee and with a human experience in the United States that they have in these Italian coffee bars? So the first, what would become Starbucks, because Howard Schultz basically was at Starbucks, and then he had this vision of wanting to bring Starbucks to a larger group of people, and the original founders of Starbucks said, well, that's just a little bit too aggressive for us. So Howard then went and started Il Giornale, which was based in Seattle. And the first Il Giornale that Schultz launched had nonstop opera music playing, menus written in Italian, and the baristas were wearing bow ties, which they found very uncomfortable, and there were no chairs. So obviously, they had to make a lot of mistakes to discover what was going to work. And the original vision had to evolve a great deal. And so as Howard says, we had to make a lot of mistakes to discover what would become the Starbucks we have today. And the same is true for Pixar. Pixar began as a division of Lucasfilm. So the person circled here to the left is Ed Catmull, who's really the founder of Pixar. And Ed Catmull is a technologist who'd gone to University of Utah. When he was in school, studied how to use digital imaging to make his hand. And he, from those early days in his educational experience, in the 1970s, University of Utah, wanted to make a full-length digital movie. That was his dream. He wanted to do something great with his life. That was his dream. And so he went to a small research unit in New York and then was recruited by George Lucas to run this hardware division within Lucasfilm. So it was really imaging hardware, and he still had his aspiration to make films. So he, after a couple years working at Lucasfilms, hired the person on the right here, who is John Lasseter. And John Lasseter, first of all, these guys look ridiculous, don't they? I mean, you can get away with this in California, I guess. That's the beauty of California. John Lasseter was an animator at Disney. He was an animator at Disney who was constantly pushing the status quo at Disney. He was making little side projects. He kept pushing the envelope. He wanted to do more animation, digital animation. He was working on these experimental projects. And he would present these ideas to people inside Disney at a time when Disney was really struggling, because Walt Disney had had this big influence on the culture of Disney, and he left, and everybody said, well, now what do we do? What would Walt do? That was a question that people asked for a long time. And so Lasseter was pushing against this envelope of a culture that was, really kind of lost and certainly not creative. And so he eventually got fired from Disney. John Lasseter got fired from Disney and went to Ed Catmull and said, hey, Ed, I know you're working on some cool technology. Do you have a job for me? And Ed said, yeah, I'll hire you. But to justify hiring an animator for a hardware company to George Lucas, Catmull had to call Lasseter a designer. So he's there, they're there, and one of the things they do is they start making the short film. One of the first projects that Lasseter worked on was this short film called The Adventures of Andre and Wally B. Came out in 1984. It was about a 1-minute short film. If you Google it, you'll see it on YouTube. It's extremely crude. It's the first Pixar film. And George Lucas really wanted to know why they were doing this. Like, explain to me why you're doing this. So the whole rationale was for having Lasseter and for having this animation unit was that they could use these short films to show the value of their technology, the hardware, and they were also developing software, and they would show these at what's called SIGGRAPH, the annual graphics conference every year, where it's a bunch of technologists and they get kind of geeky and they get excited about what the latest technology is. And at the end of every SIGGRAPH conference, they would play the latest Pixar short film. So the 1986 came around, and actually what happened between 1984 and 1986 is somebody else entered the equation at Pixar, and we all know who that was. Steve Jobs, right? So he enters because George Lucas has to sell the company. He's going through a painful divorce. They're not really selling any of the hardware. They're trying in Japan, and they're trying all these things. It's not really working. He decides to sell the division. The technology is considered to be terrific. It's top-tier technology. And, Catmull is an amazing technologist, all that, but it's just, there's no real revenue model. There's no real business model. Jobs had been fired from Apple. He had gone to Next. Next was it was kind of a draw. I mean, he kind of sold it to Apple and got his shirt back, but it wasn't really a success. And so he was looking for the next thing to do. And he talked with the technologist Alan Kay, who was a classmate of Catmull's from the University of Utah, and he said, what should I do? And he said, you got to go talk with these guys at Pixar. They've got great technology. They're going to have to spin off from Lucasfilms. They'll be for sale. You can enter. So, long story short, he buys the company for $10 million. And he was the only bidder standing at the end of this. Jobs, according to the history of Pixar, Pixar Touch, wonderful book if you're interested in the history of Pixar. Jobs never thought Pixar was going to make money from film, digital animation, never. This is Steve Jobs, who we hold up on a pedestal as the visionary of his era, and he was, in many ways, the visionary of his era. But it just goes to show that most of creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship cannot be predicted in advance, so why do we spend so much time trying? What did Pixar do? They made these short films. The first short film they made after Jobs came was Luxo Jr. So Luxo Jr. was 2 minutes and 10 seconds long. It was of 2 lamps, one adult lamp, one baby lamp, squeaking with each other, kind of talking with squeaks. And, it's at this conference, SIGGRAPH, where the little lamp jumps on a ball, pops a ball, and then it's sad, but it squeaks, And so everybody at SIGGRAPH thought it was these lamps were human, and standing ovation, and tears coming to people's eyes. And wow, this is like a huge breakthrough in this industry, this area. And so it was a small bet in the sense that compared to what was going on at Pixar, this was a very small investment. Jobs was told by George Lucas, listen, these guys are hell-bent on making animated film. Jobs says, I understand that. We're going to focus on selling hardware because that's where we're going to make, that's our business, is selling hardware. And so Catmull's out trying to sell hardware while Lasseter's making these short films and literally sleeping on a cot under his desk to make these short films. Now what happens? Well, it's a small win, right? They get a great response at SIGGRAPH. They kind of see their brand rising. They see their technology being respected in the market. And so it's lifting them. It's lifting the company. It's really the only thing they have going for it. But still, every year they have to decide, well, should we make another of these short films? And so the decision is really like this. Catmull and Lasseter go to Steve Jobs and they say, we have an idea for a short film. It's going to be a little bit longer, a little bit more complicated than Lasseter. We've developed more software, which is called RenderMan, that they developed in-house so they could start to sell a little bit in the open market. So they developed some technology. They learned how to do much better job of learning how to do storytelling, even in just a 4-minute segment. And to Jobs, his decision was basically, should I put $200,000 of my own money into this? And he consistently made that decision to, yes, do that. It's mostly last year's salary. That's $250,000 to $300,000. Plus, he had to recognize that the rest of the company was saying, hey, why is so much of our emotional energy in the company channeled towards doing these films when our core business is over here? So this is the tension that Jobs is having to manage. And in addition to that, he had, by the late 80s, invested about $50 million of his own dollars into this entity. The hardware business never got off the ground, had to lay off 50 employees, is a disaster. People in Silicon Valley are all watching Jobs, waiting to pounce on his latest failure and say, hey, you were just a one-hit wonder. So Jobs was feeling a lot of pressure, and in 1987, they do this thing, Red Stream. The next year is the really critical year. They had to decide, should we do another film? And it's a very tense time. This is right around when the layoffs happen, 50 people lay off. Jobs' back's against the wall. He's trying to sell this thing. He tries to sell it to Larry Ellison. He tries to sell it to Bill Gates. He's trying to sell it to Ross Perot, I believe. And he's just trying to get out without a failure, basically. And so he's still Steve Jobs, and what makes him Steve Jobs is the decision he makes when John Lasseter pitches him on an idea for the short film in 1988, because everybody says it's crazy, don't do it, don't do it. We got to focus on the core business. What are you doing? You've already invested $50 million in this thing, and now you're making all these short films. Lack of focus, the typical thing. And Jobs decides in 1988 to make a small bet on this latest film, Tin Toy, which is about 5 minutes, 10 seconds long, and that film wins the Academy Award for short films that year. And all of a sudden, Pixar is the coolest, hottest new thing around for its short films, for its ability to do digital filmmaking. Because it's now not just the SIGGRAPH dorky kind of small niche audience, it's boom, Academy Award. And so Steve Jobs says, okay, this is awesome. We are going to make, so strategically pivoted the company away from hardware, closed that all down, went into software, and then he said, okay, we're just going to go for this digital. And they make these short films, and it's like they make $2.5 million a year in revenue on doing commercials for Listerine and all these other, doing these digital animations. They are the leader in this new form of storytelling, this new medium for film. And so then Disney is the perfect partner for Steve Jobs to do a deal with, to be able to partner on making a full-length film. And that's really how Toy Story came about, and came out in 1995, and it's a big hit, and it changes movie making because it's this whole new medium, and wow, we have this amazing new innovation. And the reason why I find this so inspiring is that it is the ultimate story of people who believe in a vision but don't know how to get there. And they have to discover it through these series of small bets, these affordable losses, these steps by step to learn, to piece together what's going to get them to the promised land, so to speak. And so little bets are really just these, and little bets and experimental innovation happens when you're doing something new, when you're in the unknown, when you can't analyze in a spreadsheet what you should be doing. It's a way to create the data. So experiments are just a way to create the data, and little bets are these affordable losses. So you can afford to lose this. Everyone here has something that's affordable for you to lose, whether it's restructuring a meeting or figuring out how to redo a process, or it's getting into a new area and maybe trying to start a company or take an unconventional career path. You have to take these small, affordable steps where there's no risk of failure, really, because it's an affordable loss. You've decided that. And then once you've found the problems, once you've found the opportunities, as Pixar did with the short films when they were primed to do a deal with Disney, then bet big. Okay, so why is this hard? Why this is so commonsensical? This is so obvious. Okay, I know. That's the beauty of it, right? Is that the educational system, as many people here are very familiar, is in need of reform and change so that we don't grow up being taught to avoid errors at all costs. Because what happens? We develop a mindset that says that anything that's not perfect is failure. And when we have that mindset, we won't do anything new. We won't do anything that's creative because we are afraid to take even the smallest step for fear of not being perfect. And this grips us as individuals, it grips us as a nation, it grips these organizations. I travel around, I talk with all these organizations, General Mills, P&G, all these organizations, Gap, wherever you want, Clorox, you go all these places and they're all wrestling with the same challenge, which is they're really good at executing on what they know, on answering questions when they have a lot of information that can be put into a spreadsheet. They're really bad at discovery. And they're bad at discovery because their organizational processes and incentive systems are all set up to reward executing on known things, on known markets. And so that's going to have to change because every organization has to be able to innovate, otherwise they're going to die. That's Christensen's research, the innovator's dilemma, innovator's solution. So that's a clear business case. But also at the individual level, who wants to be a robot all their life? Who wants to just do a boring thing? Nobody wants to be a robot all their lives. And so people are like dying inside of these organizations. Like, please just give me something where I can do some type of creative work or some type of innovative work. And so that's something that for me is a little bet. It's just here. Just make a little bet. You're a GM or you're inside. I've talked with people inside the most risk-averse organizations in the world. And one of my favorites is the State Department because they have a manual for everything. At the State Department, there's a picture going to work every day and there's 13 manuals on a bookshelf to answer every question you might have. How disempowering is that, first of all? How ridiculous is that? Please. So one of the things the Army's learned is that they can't have a solution defined for everything anymore. They could do that during the Cold War, or they had to do that during the Cold War, where they had to be very precise in knowing if they were going to be in Germany where the underground fuel cells were, and then knowing how to launch a certain type of rocket against the Soviets if they were fighting a ground war. And all these skills had to be learned rote, so that it was like machine learning. You just act on without any thought. But now in the Middle East, obviously, as I've learned in talking with a number of people in the military, generals, and people who are running the instruction programs at West Point, is that they say, Peter, we just don't even know what the problems are going to be. We go to a new place, we have no idea what the problems are going to be. So you can't have people focused on having the perfect answer. And as Casey Haskins says, Colonel Casey Haskins, who has run military instruction at West Point, you have to make it cool to fail. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he means when you're at West Point and you're not on the battlefield, put people into situations that makes them feel very, very uncomfortable, that forces them to be wrong, so that they, through the process of experience of having to learn through discovery and trying things and iterate and figure out what the problem is before solving that problem and experimenting to kind of figure out what the need or problem. This is just this experimental process that I'll illustrate through a couple examples. If people learn how to do that, they develop this confidence that allows them to go into any situation and work with a lot of ambiguity. Now, this is sort of the future of where our education system is going to have to go, and it's going in the business schools right now. Harvard's doing a lot more experimental learning, and it's trickling through the business school community pretty quickly, but it's going to have to go all throughout society because we're just trapped by this very rigid educational system that is really structured for the industrial era. So one just corporate example that I've written about in the book that will show you the difference between the way managers are trained to think and the way entrepreneurs make decisions. This is based on research from a professor at University of Virginia, Sarah Sarasvathy, who's, in my opinion, the most insightful researcher about how entrepreneurs make decisions, just based on how I saw them make decisions when I was working in venture capital. And what she says is that if you take the first HP calculator, this is the HP 35, came out in 1972. How many people had one of these or have one of these? Yeah, you hold your head, you're like, holy cow. You're feeling old, huh? I had one. I had one too. That thing hasn't changed. So that should, you may have gotten it a couple years ago. It hasn't changed. That's the beauty. Started. So this came out in 1972 or 4, and I think it's 72. Priced at $400, which in today's terms is $2,000 some odd dollars, right? So the alternative was slide rules. Now, I don't even know what a slide rule is, and I'm not going to embarrass people in here by asking who does, but so a slide rule costs basically nothing. And so HP comes out with the first calculator. It's priced at $2,000 in today's terms, and so the question is, will this thing sell? So HP internally goes about this question by going to SRI, which is the premier market research firm in the country, premier technology market research firm in the country, and they say, can this thing sell? So they go out and they interview people and they come back and say, nope, can't sell, it's too expensive, sorry, not gonna sell. Okay. Well, this is the problem with using the analytical skill set to try to learn what can't be even put into a spreadsheet. I call it the illusion of rationality. We think, and I used to be a consultant right out of college, and this is what consultants do in many cases. It's like, okay, we're gonna have a question that a management team comes to us with, and we're going to go out and kind of find data to support the assumptions for doing something, even though no one has any idea if that data is accurate or relevant or what, but we're just gonna put it in a spreadsheet and in a PowerPoint, and it's gonna be great because it's gonna validate the team and everybody's gonna feel more comfortable, even though it's basically wrong. It's not based on anything. So what the alternative to that approach is when you're doing something new, again, this is only when you're doing something new, when it's discovery, when you need to use a discovery mindset. Okay, the way to handle that is by doing what Bill Hewlett did. Now, Bill Hewlett, when this calculator came out, carried a prototype or two with him when he traveled. And Hewlett talked with everyone when he traveled and just asked lots of questions. And this is one of the key traits of people who are creative or entrepreneurial. They're always absorbing new information and trying to learn and getting out of the office. And so he's flying on a plane, sitting next to a guy, shows him this calculator, and the guy loves the calculator. He just ringing it, boom, boom, boom. And so he tells Hewlett at the end of the flight, this is just a random dude. I would buy this calculator. So Hewlett goes back, here's the recommendation from SRI, and says, guys, I was just on a plane with a guy who said he'd buy this thing. I don't know, I mean, why don't we just build 1,000 and see what happens? Build 1,000, see what happens. Boom, send it out in the market. Within 5 months, they're selling 1,000 of these a day. 1,000 of these a day. They were actually afraid that they would not be able to keep up with the growth. That was the biggest fear. And this was the fastest growing product in HP history. So what Sarah Sarasvathi's point is that when entrepreneurs make decisions, they're not using analysis. They're thinking in terms of what they can afford to lose. They're thinking about who they know, what people they know, what insight they have, what information, what skills they have, and then they think about making decisions in terms of how they can do something really affordable, really quickly to learn, okay? So I wrote in Little Bets that entrepreneurs think of failure the way most people think of learning, right? Entrepreneurs think of failure the way most people think of learning. And that is really the source of innovation and creativity. So we all have to get beyond our boogeyman idea of what this word failure is, because really, I've been around the country, I've asked hundreds of people, what does that mean? And really, at the end of the day, what it means to most people is not being perfect, which is not failure. Failure is Steve Jobs going down with the ship at Next, or about to go down with the ship at Pixar. I mean, that would have been failure. It's not failure to put 1,000 of these calculators out into the world and have that flop. That's fine. That's how you learn. So anyway, that's a big part of the argument for the first part of Little Bets, and it is a volume game. As Bill Hewlett said, it would take about 100 small bets before you come up with the 6 breakthroughs. So it's not easy. It requires much more resilience than just, the HP case, just putting the calculator out there was all they needed to do. But in the case of Pixar, obviously it required an enormous amount of resilience and determination and a growth mindset, and this is where entrepreneurship comes from. So the question always arises, like, well, don't some people have just great ideas? Now, this is by far the exception to the rule. So David Galenson, University of Chicago, studied creative people and their processes for years, and there are people like Mozart who can come up with these ideas instantaneously in their head and then just put them down on a transcript. A whole symphony, a whole composition. Apparently, according to historians, Mozart could do this. Now, he's an example of, these are, his transcripts are perfect, flawless. He's kind of he's the nerdy guy who just gets it all done right away. And he is known as a conceptual innovator to Galenson, and really what's most relevant to Galenson's appraisal of these types of innovators, they often do their best work when they're young. And many of them are prodigies, right? So obviously, with the exception of a few people over here who are prodigies, none of us fit that bill, right? I mean, it's like most of us fall in the camp of Beethoven. When you see Beethoven's transcripts, they're just riddled with, and this is what Galenson says, is far more interesting, far more common, is, you know, these transcripts that are just riddled with pockmarks and changes, and Beethoven would literally put his pen quill through the paper late at night trying to get something done and struggled through draft after draft to finally eventually get to something that's great, but only through a lot of experimentation. He'd try this in front of audiences. So I want to share just one quick example that will hopefully be familiar to some of you. How many of you have seen Jerry Seinfeld on a big stage? Okay, smattering. Now, how many people have seen him on a small stage? How many people have seen him try to work out his ideas at the early stage of his creative process? Because this is how comedians work, as some of you may know, and as I wrote about at the outset of Little Bets when it comes to Chris Rock's creative process. Jerry Seinfeld in 2000, 2001 was already Jerry Seinfeld. He'd already been, you know, world-famous comedian, world-famous actor, TV star, and he decided he wanted to put together a stand-up comedy act. So he hadn't done this for years, really hard, and he starts going to these small comedy clubs in New York to make his routine, to start to piece his routine together. And he has to start without really any material, so he has to go just try a lot of different things to see what's going to work. And so this is a video clip from the documentary called The Comedian, which came out in 2002. It's a wonderful documentary about the creative process at work, and I would really encourage you, if you're interested in creativity or innovation entrepreneurship, to watch this, because it's not easy even for Seinfeld to do this, as you'll see right here. And hopefully this sound will come up.
Next guy to the stage. It's been a pleasure to watch him grow in the last few months. How about a big hand for Jerry Seinfeld, everybody?
Some people always say to me, it must be so easy. It's not easy.
What's easy?
For me now, because
Right.
people know who I am.
No, you get a little bit of a break up front.
Yeah.
And then you still gotta be funny. That's the beauty of stand-up, though. That's why it's closest to justice. Not that it's just ultimately, but it's close to justice. 'Cause even Jack Nicholson, wherever he looks,
Right.
he's in the middle of a comedy show, everybody give him 5 minutes of grace.
Right.
And then they'd be like, okay, Jack, you know, if you're not making us laugh, get going. You know what I mean? And he's the most beloved person there is.
Right.
So in the end, whatever it is, whether it's 3 dates or 7 dates, you're still irritated. Still annoyed, still frustrated, still hating the whole experience all the way through. And now my point here. This is my point. I got off that whole thing about the number. Oh, damn it. I don't know. What was it about? And I didn't even want to say what I just said. That's the ugly part. I don't remember. Anyway, there's something good there.
Is this your first gig?
Yeah, yes it is. Well, you know, doing all this stuff I have never said before to anyone. It's just thoughts. So this is how comedians develop material.
Right.
And as you can see, it's quite painful.
So there you have it. That's Jerry Seinfeld. So if Jerry Seinfeld has to put himself through that to do his job, my question is, what are you doing to put yourself in a little bit of an uncomfortable position every day to be learning and growing and innovating? Because really, creativity and innovation are about learning at the end of the day. Really. I mean, yeah, there are prodigies, but they're the exception to the rule. And so therefore, if you have to go out and discover, what are you doing to do that? And the beauty is that this is how we're all born, right? I mean, when we're born, we're discovery-oriented, and then we have all these things that happen to us, both cognitively and then with our educational system and social norms that cause us to be really risk averse and really afraid to try things. So just one more statistic here. This is from The Onion. They, oh, you like that? Yeah. I like this too. I'm glad you like that as much as I do. Yeah, so my favorite line in this is like how Porter Goss says he's actually as frustrated as anyone that they've been using black highlighters all these years. But yeah, 600 possibilities to get to 800 headlines every week for The Onion. It's 3% success rate. So it just gives you a sense for the sheer volume required to actually to be creative and to innovate. So I wanted to share a bit about that, and I wanted to take questions in a few minutes, but I was going to share a few things about Frank Gehry's creative process, the architect, who is the one behind LA's Walt Disney Auditorium, and the Guggenheim, as many of you probably know. And Frank Gehry is an artistic architect. For those, how many architects are here? I'm sure there's some architects here. Okay, cool. So this is the Disney Hall, and this is the model that Gehry won the competition on. Obviously very, very different, right? I mean, it looks nothing like Disney Hall. The way that Gehry works is very similar to the way a comedian works, and I just want to relate to you. I interviewed him for Little Bets and have been fascinated by his work process and wanted to share just a few little quick things with you. One is that this is how Gehry begins his creative process right here, and you'll see it's similar to Chris Rock.
Pretty funny. It's weird. Well, let's look at it for a while, be irritated by it, and then we'll figure out what to do.
What don't you like?
I don't know yet. It seems a little pompous, a little pretentious. This is the part I don't know how to put in words. It's just...
Yeah, but that's the most important part.
If one of these guys came down, and this guy came down, and this one became part of that, then I would start to like it. No, come down, yeah. Now this guy starts to... That's not a good one. This side, I still don't like this side. Craig, I still don't like it. I know why I don't like it. You know, I'll tell you why I don't like it. This has to get crankier, see?
Crankier?
I know how to do it, but it fucks up the... It would work for the African mask. It's just corrugated. You want to try it? Oh, God. Heaven help us. You need one less corrugation. You gotta get flatter, like Maggie. Like that, flatter. Yeah, like that. 2. Yeah, 2 is great. See how it works?
Yep.
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 That is so stupid looking, it's great.
It's so stupid looking.
Isn't it? It's just...
So isn't that great? I love that because when I interviewed Gary, I had the opportunity to interview him for this book. He said, we just having an open-ended discussion. He said that whenever he begins a new project, he's always afraid that he's not going to know what to do. And this surprised me. You know, Frank Gehry's 80-some-odd years old. He's in the top of his profession. He's probably the most well-known architect in the world. You'd think he'd have all this together. And in reality, he says he makes phone calls. He says he runs errands he doesn't need to run. He's human, right? And he calls this it's an insecurity that he calls a healthy insecurity because it drives him he's not done yet. He needs to keep creating. He needs to keep doing things, and I think that's inherent to all of us. We need to keep learning. We need to keep growing. And he's never satisfied as you see him like cut that little piece off, cut that little piece off. He's so detail-oriented and so obsessive that when he sits in Disney Hall, he will feel frustrated about the imperfections. They're imperfections only to him, obviously, but these are qualities that drive, I think, creativity and this willingness to put yourself out there. And the way he begins is with these prototypes. And Anne Lamott, the novelist, calls these shitty first drafts. Those are her words, not mine, but they're shitty first drafts. You just get it down, get it out. Just get whatever's on your mind out. Get whatever possibility you're thinking of out. Just like Jerry Seinfeld. Just get it out. These comedians, they don't overthink the ideas. They just scribble it on a piece of paper, and then they go into the comedy clubs, and they literally often sit on chairs, and they throw out ideas with the audience like this so that it's lower the threshold of pressure. You know, tell people, I'm just trying something out. Tell your teammates, tell your customers, listen, this is imperfect. We're coming to you with a rough prototype. It's a shitty first draft, and just recognize that this is how creativity works and innovation works. And the more you feel that permission from others to be imperfect, the more we'll feel empowered to be creative in our own way. And so I'm going to conclude here by, this is a very important topic. The hippo phenomenon, the highest paid person's opinion, is the one that typically governs how teams and organizations make creative decisions. We have a hippo. Well, probably work with a hippo. So, get that reaction. So, Frank Gehry, though, makes this point that I want to share with you, and then we'll take questions, but makes this point that it's really important to lower his status. I'm not Frank Gehry, the god of all answers. Lower his status with his team so that they are feeling empowered to share their ideas, to create a non-hierarchical environment, a truly collaborative team. And this is one of the most important ways to do it, is to not be the hippo. So here's how it works for Gehry. This is another clip from Sketches with Frank Gehry, which is a really good documentary I'd also encourage you to watch.
Let's accrue value here. We're going to do this.
Yeah.
We're going to open this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this.
Yeah.
You know what's confusing to me is what you see from here.
Perhaps what you do here, there's still kind of a grade situation.
It's like a bridge.
A little.
Well, if you do that, you know, you could almost do that and walk under it to the lakefront. That would be the ideal.
Yeah.
I mean, if we do this, it takes it out of the realm that I was worried about.
Well, I wasn't worried about that. I don't.
No, you don't worry about the
wasn't
same things I
worried
worry
about
about.
it. I'm more naive.
Edwin is more contentious with me than Craig is. Have you noticed? Yes. For me, that's great because it just makes it all much more interesting. He's been with me 15 years. For the first 5 years he was here, he didn't talk. I couldn't get a word out of him. He just sat and watched. And then now, 15 years later, I can't stop him from talking. I don't think I could do the buildings alone anymore. I've gotten so used to the team to play with.
He surrounds himself with good people. What he likes to do is he gets the vague idea, kind of very loosely. Well, you know, something kind of like, something kind of like this, but kind of like, what I'm thinking is something more kind of like that, you know what I mean? So this kind of thing is what I got in mind, you know what I mean? And the guys are standing around, yeah, I think I got it, Frank. And they run off and they do some stuff and they come back and he goes, no, not quite like that. I thought it's a little bit more like this. You know what I'm like? Gosh, you guys have just, I want you to really kind of more like that. You know what I mean?
No, but if you see the stair like you see here, where it ends.
Where it's sticking out.
Yeah, do that.
The communication is almost nonverbal. We've worked enough together that he can say like 2 words and I'll understand what he wants. Or a quick sketch or reference to a painting or a piece of sculpture and say, try this.
The only thing I'm worried about is these guys wanted something a lot more exuberant.
They do.
Well, I'd rather go to that middle color titanium. That would be beautiful. See that red titanium?
But you sure it's not going to be too red?
The other day, we're doing our offices. He sent me a fax where I was, and he said, would you mind if we flipped the plan? So that's typical Edwin. I would do that myself if he wasn't there, but he's there. I think of it as an opportunistic thing. Maybe one of the kids in the office, just the way he put the model together that day, made me see something. They see they're part of it. So it engenders a great sense of teamwork, which gets you to the end. Craig and I will go home tonight, separately, and we'll agonize about this. And we'll come in tomorrow.
We'll have a dream tomorrow night.
And we'll say, and we usually come to the same conclusion when it's wrong, right? And what makes it wrong is, what's wrong is if it's too easy, or if we think we're falling into some kind of cliche.
Or we already did it.
Or we already did it.
That's different. That's different than too easy, right?
Too easy is that
too easy?
I guess I got to suffer a little before.
But that's neurotic. How do you tell the difference between an aesthetic discipline and neurosis?
So the thing I love about that clip is that it shows the true process, the way Gary works. And I think it shows a leadership style for the future, which is to reduce status, to not be a hippo, to be able to get the best insights from everyone around you in a truly collaborative way, to have humor, to recognize that no one person has all the answers. And no person in the corporate world exemplifies this better than Ed Catmull, back to Pixar, back to where we began. And Ed Catmull says that the Pixar creative process is literally going from suck to non-suck when they do their movies. And so he recognizes that the ideas for movies develop bit by bit, little bit by little bit, little bit by little bit, and literally, Pixar is a company that is all about little bets all the time. So it's my favorite example to learn from and to share it with people on. And Catmull is a person who, like Gary, is living his personal dreams. He is able to accomplish his dream that he had when he was a graduate student, not by following the status quo, not by taking the conventional routes, but by being what I call a black sheep. And this comes directly from Pixar, by the way. Brad Bird, a director of Pixar, says that when he works on movies, he likes to work with black sheep, people who look at problems differently, who challenge the status quo at Pixar so they can do the impossible every time. And they have under Bird, and as a company they have. So black sheep are people who are willing to follow their own voice and be originals. And this is what Brad Bird says: give us the black sheep, the ones who are willing to do a different way of doing things. And Frank Gehry is one of those people. You're probably one of those people too. Yeah. He's one of those people too. And I would encourage everybody here to be a black sheep and to make a little bet tomorrow in your own life to do things a little bit differently, because that's all that you need to do to be a little bit more creative. And I hope that this had some insight for you, and thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you. Just so you know, afterward, Peter will be out front in the lobby signing his book, Little Bet. Some of you read Fast Company magazine. Great magazine. Yeah, if you haven't, you need to pick it up. For the Q&A, we're happy to have Cliff Quang, who is the senior editor at Fast Company, who's going to be doing a Q&A with the audience and with Peter. So, Cliff.
Hi, I think there's, we don't have too much time for the Q&A, so I
10
think that
minutes,
we should
10
start
minutes.
pretty soon with the questions from the audience. You can see mics in the wings right here if anybody wants to come to the mics. But I'll, in the meantime, just get started with one question. A lot of your examples revolve around entrepreneurs, people starting things on their own that essentially have their backs against the wall. Not all of us work in organizations that are, startup organizations that are, defined by one or two people. So I'm wondering if you think that there are really good models out there for making little bets within the context of a larger organization.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no one model per se, but I think just the very nature of making little bets. So this is a guy in the State Department, back to the State Department, who was telling me, here I've got these 13 manuals to try to make every decision in my job, and I want to be creative, I want to be innovative. And so he said, well, the one little bet I could make was to go to the ambassador of Italy and offer to work with him to bring together a group of Italian entrepreneurs to create a little community of Italian entrepreneurs and then bring them to the US and expose them to Silicon Valley and things. And that little bet within an organization that's as risk averse as any I know of, and within a job, his role, he was a field officer, he made that little bet, and now they've brought that to a whole bunch of different embassies and scaled it. So he's now, and his career's risen. He's, by virtue of achieving those small wins, which are really fundamental to any creative progress, especially within an organization where you have a lot of constraints. You have to get win after, you have to show progress, you have to get small wins. He's able to, have his career rise as a result. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what you're describing, though, is kind of a tension between, making these little gambles, but also actually putting the stakes high enough that somebody feels compelled to actually pull something off.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, I mean, what do you think raises the stakes for people when, there might not be something that's defined yet that might not have responsibility layered around it?
Yeah, I think you need to know the context you're operating within. I mean, in the State Department example, this guy, I'm forgetting his name, I apologize for forgetting his name, but he understood that the Italian ambassador wanted to do something like this. He was a former business person who was in Italy, and he wanted to do something like this. So he was excited about it because it fit with his goals, right? In other examples, like if an organization doesn't want to think differently and do things differently and evolve, then and there are organizations like that, and there aren't champions at the higher levels to support, give you a little air cover, then there's some organizations you just have to leave, I think, if it's not working. And if it's a different case where people really are trying to get a job or they're trying to reinvent their lives or their careers. I went to Detroit last year and saw a lot of examples of people who, I love about this favorite person I met was Alan Kainertz, this guy who is a great craftsman, and his offices are in an old industrial office building in Detroit that looks like it's literally been bombed out. I mean, it's just, you feel like you're in like the Middle East. And when you see it from the outside, it's a building that publishers used to be in. They've gone. There's really artists and entrepreneurs in these buildings trying to reinvent themselves. And Alan used to renovate kitchens in Detroit for kind of the middle class of Detroit, and then all those people left. So he had to, as he said, his mission in life is to stay in business, and so he had to go out and reinvent himself. And he now makes these really fine chairs that ironically are very similar to the types of chairs Frank Gehry might make. I mean, they're really beautifully designed chairs. He's won design awards, and he's had to learn how to use the internet to market, and he's done it all through a series of little bets. And just by believing that in his mission, which is to stay in business in that case. Also, he wants to be a great craftsman. So I don't know if that answers.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Do we have any questions from the audience? Do we have one here?
Sir.
Yeah, you talk about a lot of other folks with their little bets and the ones that paid off and the ones that didn't, and wondered what your personal little bet that was maybe the biggest failure, biggest learning, and then the one that was maybe the biggest payoff.
Well, it was, I think, one and the same. When I was an accidental author, I came out of business school and co-authored True North with Bill George based on some interest I'd had in business school, and I had, with a group of my classmates, established a class on leadership. So that got me into leadership, and working with somebody like Bill George, who's the former CEO of Medtronic, who already has a national reputation, is pretty easy. That's an easy way to become an author, and it was a lucky opportunity for me. And then I went to work in a company, and I had to decide if I wanted to stay working in a company. And it was kind of, I won't mention the name of the company, but It was a company that was putting ideas out into the world that nobody was responding to, very, very, very basically. And it was a media company, so I suggested that we bring in the Stanford Design School team to kind of think about, well, what problems are we actually trying to solve? What needs do our customers have? What are our products actually doing to make these people's lives better? And a lot of people in the company say, well, that's great, sure, 2 hours, bring them in, let's have a conversation. And the person who's in charge of innovation, or really head of innovation, said, we already know how to innovate, Peter. So I said, okay, I'm going to leave. I took a huge leap at that stage in my life and was very, very afraid. I didn't have a job. I had been having personal turmoil. I had, really had to learn how to write a book from the ground up. And so I had published a book, that was very lucky. So agents would talk with me, literary agents would talk with me, and I put together a 3-page little bet with some very rough ideas on why I thought it was really important to bring design and entrepreneurship together. And the 3-pager was titled Experimental Innovation, Turning Small Bets into Big Wins. And I had a conversation with an agent who's Seth Godin's agent. And Seth Godin, well-known person, really empowering guy, I think, in many ways. Well, his agent was probably not the person I would work with because Seth and I write different types of books. So I think, well, I'll talk with her and I'll just tell her at the outset, hey, this is a shitty first draft. And so I did. And I said, this is kind of what I'm thinking. And she said, well, I like, that you got the design school stuff here. But Peter, where are you going with this? And I really didn't know. I mean, I was like, not sure what the core idea for the book was. I wasn't sure how to even go about publishing, the publishing process, and I really need a lot of help. And she berated me for 30 minutes. I mean, just like, hey, this, that, the other thing. And I was about to throw up. Because I was so many doubts in my head, so much self-doubt. And it's saliva in your mouth, as you're about to throw up. So right as I was about to hang up, she's like, well, the one thing I think is great is, you've published, you design school, and I really like this little bets in the subtitle. And so I said, well, yeah, that's kind of fundamental to what I'm getting at. And I'd gotten the term from somebody else I'd talked with, Ned Barnholt, who's the former CEO of Agilent. And so I moved that into the title of the prototype after a few days. And then when I was talking with other authors and agents, I would just bounce it off everyone and tell them, hey, this is really preliminary, and I know it's bad, but I'm just trying to learn here. And everybody said, oh, this brilliant idea. This Little Bets is just brilliant. And I just said, the process works basically, and within a couple months, or within a month, I think the book sold, and there's a big auction with publishers, and it was really all about this title, So as hard as it was to go through that process, it got easier over time, which is what the research says, and I found through my experience, and now I do. It's just a part of my existence to make these little bets, and we're actually starting an organization called Black Sheep, so that's, I think, going to be a very fruitful output of starting by jumping off a cliff and with a really shitty draft. So I don't know. That's maybe a long explanation.
We've got one woman waiting very patiently right here.
All right.
Your question?
And I'll be outside if people have other questions.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Peter, for sharing. You spoke a little bit about leadership and you spoke a little bit about teamwork. One of the things that I'm finding is the importance of surrounding yourself with people who are going to support you and people who are going to challenge you.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you could just speak briefly either about personal experience or experience that you've seen, how you can get exponential results and difference in the people that you surround yourself with.
Oh, wow. Great question. Yeah, I mean, so I think you are what you eat. I mean, it just boils down to that. Who you hang out with is what you are. And so in my life, I used to hang out with a lot of investors because that's what I did. And they're cool, and I'm still friends with a lot of them. But now my peer group is really, ballerinas and, people who are artists and entrepreneurs. And so it feels very natural to me to be doing creative work. So from a creative work standpoint, I think it's fundamental that you surround yourself with people who are like-minded, and that's part of the reason why we're establishing Black Sheep, is to give people a community on Facebook at the start where they can be around like-minded people. Because you can't do it on your own. Nobody does any of this on their own. I mean, Gary needs his team just as Catmull needs, everybody at Pixar need their team environment, and they need that emotional support, because the creative process is so full of ups and downs. I mean, inevitably. And resilience is such an important quality. And when it comes to the leadership question, I just think, yeah, being innovative requires people to lead. You have to have a willingness to lead, and you got to be different. I'm wearing a wristband now for the Starbucks campaign, Indivisible campaign, where they're creating jobs through microfinance organizations by selling these wristbands at Starbucks. And I support it because, full disclosure, Howard's a friend and has been a mentor. And so I supported his initiative last year. I was one of the signers of his letter. But Howard Schultz goes out and leads. He goes out and does things. And I see all these other organizations where in retail, people are so afraid to lead. And I'm not going to mention the names of the companies, but I just see Starbucks out there doing stuff and trying things and feeling confident because they've got this culture of being willing to experiment, and other organizations are just totally risk averse, batten down the hatches. We're going to wait for the storm to pass before we do anything. And they're the ones who are kind of 5 to 6% growers every year, and it's not really that exciting, to me at least, So does that answer your question about leadership? I'm biased, obviously, but that's my point of view. We all have this potential. We all have this potential to lead, and that's really the first book. That's what Bill George really articulated well in Authentic Leadership and True North. So.
Well, we're being called to a hard stop, unfortunately, but I think you were planning on taking some questions,
Yeah, I'll be outside
people afterwards. Sorry that we couldn't get to your questions.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully you can find some time with Peter.
I appreciate it. Thank you.